Welcome back to Joe Stunner Boxing. If you were to debate what is the worst of the four ruling bodies in boxing, yes, you could go back and forth amongst all four and make a case against any of them because they all have their moments, don't they? Regrettably. But for me personally, I think the worst, as bad as the WBA are, I would say the WBC is the worst. And I wanted to go through a few of their, I don't know, crimes and misdemeanors, should we call it? Because I really think they're awful. They are just absolutely terrible. And Mauricio Suleiman is, well, he's a piece of work, isn't he? Now, if you are of a certain age or you understand boxing history, a little bit of boxing history, you will know that the president for life was originally Jose Suleiman, who was Mauricio's father. He was very, very closely connected to Don King, if you know what I mean. And lots of rankings were, shall we say, massaged, and lots of King fighters were given certain preferential treatment, and so on and so forth. Well, Mauricio, he may well have outdone his father in terms of, shall we say, controversial decisions, because I want to go through a few reasons why I think the WBC is bad, and a lot of the blame will lie at Mauricio Suleiman's feet, because the WBC is, after all, a dictatorship, just as it was back in the 90s when Jose was still alive, so it is in the 2020s with Mauricio at the helm. It's the same thing. So where do we begin? Well, how about we begin with the whole issue of letting off certain fighters who have tested positive for PEDs. And I'm not going to go through a great long laundry list of them, but the two that are, well, the one that pops into my head is Canelo. And the other one that is in the foreground is, for me, is Luis Nery, because he fights Inoue in 4 days' time, 5 days' time? Monday, innit? 5 days' time, yeah. Well, in the case of both of these fighters, they were not punished. In fact, they were allowed to keep their belts. Canelo was given some sort of retrospective 6-month, utterly meaningless punishment, faux punishment. Neary, it was pretty much the same thing. What do these guys have in common? They are both Mexican. Which brings us on to another point, which is the favoritism shown to Mexican fighters. And it's not just with letting off cash cows, from failed PED tests. It's to do with rankings and so on. I don't want to, Christ almighty, this video would be an hour long if we went into all the different minutiae of each of these issues. But look at the rankings, look at the amount of WBC belts that are made available, or that chances are given to Mexican fighters. It's not always the case, of course. There are WBC champions from all over the world. But there is no doubt that the favoritism towards Mexican fighters, it's there. Let's put it that way. It's there. It's there. And then we come on to the subject of mandatory contenders, or more specifically, the lack thereof for certain champions. Now, it's going to be nearly 3 years. In fact, it's approaching 3 years. I think it's only another couple of months. It will be 3 years since Jamal Charlo defended his WBC middleweight title. 3 years. He's had one fight, which was a 10-rounder, a non-title fight. How is this guy still the WBC champion? At the very least, he should be what you might call, champion in recess. what are interim belts for? If Charlo has had his mental health issues outside the ring, or there are other issues, or whatever the case is, if there's some extenuating circumstance, the whole point of interim belts is if a guy is indisposed, injured, ill, whatever, okay, we're not going to strip you of your belt. We're going to call you a champion in recess, and then we have an interim belt. Two guys fight for it, and the winner eventually faces the champion. They've done it before, and in theory, it isn't too bad an idea. I don't like secondary belts. I'll come to them in a minute, but I do feel that there's just no excuse for why Charlo should still be WBC champ. Haven't they got an interim? Who is the WBC interim middleweight champion? I don't know. I don't actually know. I should look that up beforehand. But if that's the case, then, call Charlo champion in recess, okay, and you can. It's kind of like when Vitaly Klitschko came back and fought Samuel Peter. Peter had picked up the WBC belt. He beat the Russian guy whose name escapes me. This was after Vitaly had, I don't know can't remember whether he'd retired or whether he'd been forced out through injury or there was something going on. But then he came back and got a straight shot at Samuel Peter and beat him. And so he sort of reclaimed his throne, if you like. But he was given a direct line to the belt because the WBC considered that there were extenuating circumstances. Why haven't they done the same with Charlo? And it isn't just Charlo, because if you look at Tyson Fury, I'm not sure how long he's been champion, WBC champ. What is it, 3.5 years maybe? Yeah. And he's made one mandatory. So mandatory contenders, that's another issue. Some fighters are stripped, others don't make a mandatory defence in years. They're allowed to get away with it. So again, we're back to favoritism for certain fighters. And why do certain fighters have favoritism? Probably because they have the right connections. We're talking certain promoters are in the good books, whereas others, nope. You have nothing to offer us, so off you go. There's then the issue, and admittedly, the WBC is not the only ruling body that does this. I think they all do, and that's the amount of belts that are on offer. The WBC do have a rival for this, and that's the WBA. I think on this particular point, the WBA are probably even worse than the WBC. But do we need all of those belts? No, we don't. And I'm not just talking about interim belts. There are, again, this is not just the WBC, but there are, all sorts of regional belts. The WBO have even got one called the Global Belt. Well, surely that's the world title. And then there are European belts. Again, not just the WBC on this point, but they're just as bad. Well, they're guilty. If there's a sanctioning fee to be had, the WBC will step in and snatch it off out of your hand. And it's all kind of it muddies the water, and it makes it a total headache trying to think of who's the champion, who's the mandatory contender, because if you hold the interim belt, are you above the number one contender or not? And you get there's all these all this cement in your head about who's doing what and who owns what and who's meant to be next. And I'm sure there have been occasions in the past where fighters that have been left on the shelf. I mean, Dillian White is a good example of when he was the mandatory for a while, for so long, and then Fury took the belt. There are probably grounds for suing the WBC over, keeping them as a mandatory and breaking their own rules, and which brings us to the next point, which is the WBC tend to make up the rules as they go along. There's always a sort of rather vague issue fudging little caveat to most of their rules, which they'll allow certain favourite fighters to get away with XYZ, as long as they're on the quiet doing ABC. It's all very chummy in certain quarters. And yeah, I mean, I suppose I could go on. I could think of other examples, but you get the message. And again, I repeat, most of this has to lie at the feet of the dictator, who in this case is Mauricio Suleiman. Is it going to change? Probably not. Probably not. Suleiman is president for life, just like his father was. They probably hold some sort of election, but I can't see him being usurped and booted out. He's probably going to be there for the long term. So yeah, that's my little rant against the WBC. I'm just out of all those things, what is the worst for me? It's the PED thing. I hate PEDs and I hate fighters that knowingly try to cheat. I think it's disgusting. I don't give anyone a free pass, and I think the fact that certainly Canelo, the way he was allowed to get away with this tainted meat bullshit thing, and Neary as well, and a few others, it really sort of makes my blood simmer. So that's the worst of the lot. But all the other things I mentioned, yeah. I mean, it's too much. To me, it mars boxing badly. I mean, and another thing, one thing I didn't mention, but I want to mention it. It's still on the subject of belts. Is what is all these special belts that the WBC make? I bet you when Mike Tyson fights Jake Paul, they'll make a belt for it. I bet you. They do it all the time. So what do you think? Do you agree with me that the WBC is the worst of the four ruling bodies, or do you think I'm being too harsh on them? I don't think so, but let me know. And if you don't think they're the worst, who do you think's the worst? And have I missed anything out that really gets your goat, and you think, God, I hate it when that happens, you know? I think I've mentioned probably the main reasons, but let me know what you think. Do you agree with me or not? Comments below, please. I'll have a read of them. And of course, as always, subscribe to the channel. If you like the video, hit the like button and spread the word about Joe Stunner Boxing. Thanks a lot, guys and ladies, and I'll speak to you soon. Bye for now.